in a place renowned for notorious and larger than life characters. Pat, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Larry, and thank you both, Larry and David, for inviting me.
Pat, just unmute yourself, please. There we go.
I thought you were joking. Thank you, Larry, and thank you, David, both of you, for inviting me. I'm going to try to share my screen now and hope for the best. Okay, I assume everybody can see that all right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so there's an old saying, unattributed, we don't know who wrote this, but in politics in Canada, they say, in the Maritimes, politics is a pastime. In Quebec, a religion. In Ontario, a business. On the prairies, a cause. And in British Columbia, anyone? I even put it in Comic Sans just to accentuate the point. Party politics in British Columbia began in 1903. Sir Richard McBride decided there would be an election in 1903 and announced that he would form the Conservative Party of British Columbia, being the first partisan government in the province. If he could have foreseen the future, he might have behaved otherwise, because with the exception of Quebec, which has no provincial Conservative Party, there has been no Conservative Party in the country less successful than the Conservative Party of British Columbia. McBride himself did serve a good term. He would serve from 1903 to 1915, but his successor, Bowser, failed to be reelected, and the Liberals served until 1928. Oh, by the way, I think maybe Sir Richard thought that his peerage would be a bit of a hoity-toity thing in a frontier province, so he gave himself a nickname, the People's Dick. In any event, he served until until 1915, and then the Liberals governed until Simon Fraser told me won in 1928. And what happens when somebody's elected in 1928? R.B. Bennett, Herbert Hoover, Simon Fraser told me, the Depression comes and they get the boot. So thorough was the drubbing of the Conservatives in 1933 that they didn't even actually contest the election. The party essentially collapsed, and some independent Conservatives did run and were elected, but not a single Conservative by name was elected in 1933. 1933 saw the election of Duff Patello as premier. Patello, a Liberal. What is most significant, I think, about the 1933 election is that it saw the beginning of the first presence of the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, the CCF, which is the precursor to the NDP, elected to a provincial legislature for the first time. I believe that the 1933 BC election was the first election ever contested by the CCF. And this scenario set up the binary that would define British Columbia politics up until today, and that is free enterprise versus socialism. I'm sure you appreciate that I'm being somewhat facetious in some of my language here, but the Conservative and Liberal parties and the parties that of their successors became essentially obsessed with keeping the socialists out of power. And that became the modus operandi for politics for the next 90 years. Whoops, something's going wrong here. What happened was the Conservative Party did revive after its catastrophic 1933 election. And that was good for them, but they and the Liberals all recognized that now, with the CCF on the scene, they had the potential to split the vote, and with the result that none of them wanted, which was the election of the CCF. So in 1941, John Hart, the guy on the left, who was the Liberal finance minister under Petillo, and most of the Liberal caucus joined with the Conservative Party and formed a coalition, or agreed to form a coalition. Petillo was opposed to the coalition and he resigned. And so the coalition was formed without Petillo. The first premier was John Hart on the left. The second premier was Byron Boss Johnson on the right. Both of them Liberals. The Liberals were always the senior party in the coalition. The Conservatives were always the minor party in the coalition. Whoops, sorry. And so while they realized by about 1952, both the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party in British Columbia were notorious for internal bickering. The Conservatives in particular were riven by internal dissension and infighting. And so, you know, just getting along with themselves was hard enough. Getting along with a coalition partner was even more difficult. By 1951-52, there was a giant fight over a proposed hospital insurance plan, and the coalition essentially exploded. It was also to be noted that for the entire decade of the coalition, both the Federal Liberal Party and the Federal Conservative Party were vehemently opposed to the coalition. Both of them felt, probably accurately, that the coalition undermined the federal party's brand in the province. And in fact, in several federal elections, there's good evidence that that was the case. So they realized that they could no longer cohabitate. The coalition broke apart, but how were they going to keep the socialists out of power now? So they agreed on a little political jiggery-pokery, and they instituted something that they thought would be the solution to their problem. And that was the single transferable ballot, where instead of the first past the post system that we have now, in which you just vote for the one person you want, this was a ranked ballot. So you put your first and second choice. The assumption here was that the Liberals would vote for the Conservatives as their second choice, the Conservatives would vote for the Liberals as their second choice, and the CCF would be out in the cold. What they did not anticipate was this guy. Love him or hate him, British Columbia's 20th century really belonged to W.A.C. Bennett. Almost out of nowhere, W.A.C. Bennett led the Social Credit Party to a minority government in 1952. The obvious question is, what is social credit? It doesn't matter. The short answer is social credit was a philosophy or a scheme developed by a British engineer by the name of C.H. Douglas, essentially promoting a kind of universal basic income in which every citizen would be given scrip or credit, social credit, of a certain amount of money a month, intended to spur the economy by flooding it with money. All of that is pretty irrelevant because W.A.C. Bennett really just used social credit as a vehicle for his own ambitions. But first of all, how did this happen? Where did Bennett come from, and how did he end up coming almost out of nowhere to win the 1952 election? Social credit had been around in BC since 1937, and it had been in the government. It had been governing Alberta since 1935. But right up until the 1949 election, they had never gained more than 2% of the popular vote. They were a fringe party. Nobody seemed to take them seriously. But what happened, Bennett was elected as a conservative MLA in 1941. That was the year the coalition began. So he was a conservative MLA, but of course, as soon as he was sworn in, was sitting with the coalition. While there was a lot of division within the coalition, he argued fervently that the coalition should be formalized and in fact become a single political party. Given the infighting within and between the parties, that didn't happen. And his two efforts to, he ran twice for Conservative Party leader, and he lost both times. After the second time, he quit the party, as did his colleague Tilly Ralston, a Vancouver Conservative MLA, and they sat as independents for a little while. And then just before the 1952 election, they joined the Social Credit Party. Social Credit going into the 1952 election did not have a leader. There was no leader. So it was only after the election that the caucus of 19 members got together and chose W.A.C. Bennett as their leader and ergo premier, because ultimately he and Ralston were the only two in the caucus with any government experience. And of course, I'm guessing they weren't going to choose the woman. Anyway, also Bennett was an extremely ambitious politician. But there is, I think anybody who sort of has a general feel for that era in politics has a misperception. In fact, I did until I was doing some research on this. And I think the mythology is that the Liberals and Conservatives, when they broke the coalition, were thought that their party, their people would vote for the other party. The Liberals would vote for the Conservatives and vice versa. A lot of people think that what happened was the Liberals voted for the Liberals first and the Social Credit second. The Conservatives voted Conservative and Social Credit second, and Social Credit came out of nowhere. Turns out, thanks to Professor David Elkins at UBC, who studied these two elections, that's actually not generally the case. And what is really counterintuitive, given hindsight, where we have come to see the second half of the 20th century in BC politics as a dichotomy between the NDP or the CCF NDP and Social Credit. In 1952, Social Credit and the CCF gained the same voters. CCFers voted for Social Credit for their second choice. Social Creditors voted for the CCF. Part of this may have been that they were both outside the mainstream. They were both protest parties with a bit of a stream of populism, and they both were opposed to the old line Liberal and Conservative parties. But part of it also was just a basic misunderstanding about what the party stood for, because it was so new. And perhaps the whole idea of this funny money Social Credit script, monthly payments to every resident, might have led people to think that the Social Credit Party was further to the left than they were. And by a year later, after W.A.C. Bennett organized his own defeat on a confidence bill because he believed that he could win a majority government, the understanding of what Social Credit was among British Columbia voters had changed dramatically, and it was viewed as a right-wing party. So what happened then was CCFers utterly abandoned Social Credit as their second choice, but old line Liberals and Conservatives jumped on the bandwagon. And as he thought he could, Bennett won a majority government in 1953. And what was the first thing he did? Cancel the transferable ballot. So he won by this little bit of political jiggery-pokery, and as soon as he had succeeded there, he changed it. Now, the coalition of liberals and conservatives all along had said, you know, you need to vote for us to keep the socialists out. Now the shoe was on the other foot, and Social Credit was able to say, we're the ones you have to vote for if you want to keep out the socialists. That was sort of the confusion. Unfortunately, I'm not able to, because I'm sharing the full screen, I can't see the next thing, so I sometimes fall a little bit behind. The chaos in the old line parties was astounding. It was incredible how quickly catastrophe befell the Liberal Party, but especially the Conservative Party in BC. The Conservative, both the Liberal and Conservative leaders lost their seats in the 1953 election. And the Conservative Party, which had taken 17% of the vote in 1952, fell to 5.6%. And just to give you some scope, in the next 18 elections, from 1953 until last year, the Conservative Party broke double digits only twice. And in 8 of those 18 elections, they won less than 1% of the popular vote. The Liberals are a different story. And this is really, the Liberal Party is the sort of the string that goes through this whole bizarre story. And that is, the Liberals managed to maintain from 1952 right through 1969, they stubbornly managed to keep almost exactly 20% of the vote in every single election. 1 in 5 British Columbians continued to vote Liberal provincially through those 2 decades, even though that didn't translate very much into seats. The Liberals usually won 5 seats. Once they went up to 6, they went as low as 2, but they consistently kept 20% of the vote. Liberal support all through that period was concentrated in ridings like, and try to picture, Point Grey, North Vancouver, West Vancouver, and Oak Bay. These are what's the word? They're high-income neighborhoods. They're the creme de la creme, as somebody once famously said. And the theory, I don't think it's mine originally, but I think a reasonable theory is that the 20% of people who continued voting Liberal through this time were perhaps driven by the idea that Social Credit was better than the socialists, but there's still a bunch of rural hicks. And so Social Credit always had trouble breaking into some of the more urban and affluent ridings. Now, you could hardly be more fortunate. You know, if Simon Fraser Tolmie became premier at the time of the Depression, imagine becoming premier at a time of the most explosive economic growth in British Columbia history. The 1950s and 60s, some of us have some memories of them, were a time of extraordinary growth in British Columbia. And along comes W.A.C. Bennett, who had no shortage of ideas. Now, the funny thing about Bennett was that for all his bluster about socialism, his government was a leader in the country in terms of government intervention in the economy. He was extremely fond of mega projects and huge visionary concepts. To realize these, he took steps that had the CCF or NDP done them, he would have called it communism. He took over the Blackball ferry lines to create the BC Ferry Corporation in 1958. He expropriated the province's largest privately owned hydroelectric company to create BC Hydro in 1962. Massive hydroelectric dam building projects on the Columbia and Peace rivers were the backbone of an enormous new economic expansion. He expanded the former Pacific Great Eastern Railway into BC Rail to stimulate development, especially in the interior and the north. He, with his Minister of Highways, Flying Phil Ghilardi, undertook a massive expansion of the roads throughout the province. Flying Phil got his nickname as the Minister of Highways. He was from Kamloops, so I guess he went back and forth from the interior to the coast an awful lot, and he racked up a vast number of speeding tickets. And his defense essentially was, listen, I've built these super modern, super highways that essentially make the speed limits obsolete. There was a lot of ribbon cutting in this period. And here is a picture of Premier Bennett cutting a ribbon with Jack Diamond to open the exhibition park racetrack at the PNE. Despite all this growth, Bennett kept the civil service extremely small, and he was a notorious penny pincher. Cabinet ministers needed the Premier's personal approval to make a long distance phone call. After 20 years, winning 7 consecutive elections, Bennett was utterly in control of his party. In 1969, most people thought and expected that it would be his last race. But social credit was so much a creature of Bennett's own invention that there was no obvious successor. By 1972, the NDP had a new leader in Dave Barrett, who was different. He was different than most politicians, and it was especially difficult for Bennett to depict Barrett as the scary socialist bogeyman that he had done with Barrett's predecessors. Barrett was a funny guy. He didn't come across as scary. He himself in his memoirs admitted he was a pudgy little social worker who really didn't frighten anyone, although he legitimately should have frightened W.A.C. Bennett. He was also 30 years younger than Bennett, which really put into contrast the Premier's age. Something else in 1972 that was absolutely critical and would not, I would say Barrett would never have become Premier if this had not happened. And that is, as I said, the Liberal Party had maintained roughly 20% of the vote all along. The Conservative Party had basically given up hope. For 20 years. They had not been in the legislature and often barely even campaigned to win a seat or two. In 1972, they smelled blood and they put on a genuine campaign, and they went from 0.1% of the popular vote in 1969 to 12.67% in 1972. Now you can imagine almost all of that vote came from social credit. The Conservatives only won 2 seats. The Liberals kept the 5 that they usually had, but with the split in the vote, the NDP, with only 39% of the vote, won a huge majority government. Business, understandably, certainly social credit, and before then the coalition had been warning very, very strongly that the sky would fall on British Columbia's prosperity if the socialists ever came to power. And so you see the Vancouver Sun headline, "Business takes news calmly." The subhead, "Wait and see," becomes maxim. Undoubtedly, 1972 will go down in history as the most dramatic revolution in BC political history. There is, I've asked a few people this, there's a rumor or an urban myth maybe, that Barrett got up, the first cabinet meeting, got up on the huge long cabinet table, threw himself from one end to the other, sliding down, and declared, "We're here for a good time, not a long time." Now, nobody who could have been there ever was able to tell me whether that really happened. And it's also perhaps worth noting that the Trooper song, "We're Here for a Good Time, Not a Long Time," didn't come out for several years later. So whether that actually happened is one thing, but the the attitude absolutely was there. And in his memoirs, Barrett said, "We discussed whether we were really going to make fundamental changes in British Columbia or whether we would try to hang on for another term, rationalizing that we'd get the job done next time around. We agreed unanimously to strike while the iron was hot." In 39 months, 1,200 days, Barrett's New Democratic Party government passed 357 diverse and sometimes radical pieces of legislation, more than any single government before or since. Now, a lot of the NDP policies were quite revolutionary, but what we're going to do a run through here. Hold on to your hats, because this is in no particular order. This will just give you an idea of the range of extraordinary things, agree or disagree with them, just the unbelievable number of policies and programs that this government in only 3 years introduced. So again, in no particular order: created the Agricultural Land Reserve, ICBC, the Provincial Ambulance Service and air ambulances, pharmacare for seniors, neighborhood pubs, BC's first Ministry of Housing, rent controls, the most expansive human rights code in Canada, mandatory kindergarten, reduced teacher-student ratios, created the C-Bus, proclaimed BC Day as a stat holiday, established Whistler as Canada's first resort municipality, saved Cypress Bowl from logging, turning it into a provincial park, ended logging and mining in provincial parks, banned the export of raw logs, funded the City of Vancouver's purchase of the Orpheum Theatre, raised the minimum wage from $1.50 to $2.50, created Mincome, which guaranteed a minimum income of $200 per month for people over 60, expanded community colleges, new daycare facilities, French immersion in public schools, created Robson Square, doubled the pay of MLAs to $25,000 and made the role more full-time. It used to be basically a part-time job. Significantly increased welfare rates, almost doubled human resources spending, provided collective bargaining rights, including the right to strike to government employees, introduced a new labor code, established the Islands Trust to avoid uncontrolled development in the Gulf Islands, purchased the Princess Marguerite to sail between Victoria and Seattle, refurbished the Royal Hudson as a rail tourism attraction, created a police commission to determine policing standards, set out provisions for dealing with complaints against police, required elected and appointed officials to disclose financial holdings so the public could see real or potential conflicts of interest, increased funding for the arts, expanded funding for legal aid, initiated the province's first consumer services ministry, introduced Canada's strongest at the time consumer protection legislation. Are you bored yet? Eliminated succession duties on farms transferring from parents to children, launched a range of self-determination initiatives for First Nations, created the status of women's office, funded women's shelters and health facilities, including agencies for victims of rape, overhauled the family court apparatus, created the BC Energy Commission, upped mineral royalties, acquired Shaughnessy Veterans Hospital, which would be transformed into the BC Children's Hospital, and banned pay toilets. So that just gives you a hint of the incredible speed with which this government went through those 3 years. Now, I'm just going to step away from politics for a minute and talk about Barrett's relationship with his Judaism. There have been rumors I've heard that some people think that Barrett was not particularly connected with his Judaism. I'll tell you that I've spoken to his widow, his son, some of his best friends, and they assure me that that is not the case. Bernie Simpson, I don't know, is Bernie joining us tonight? I don't know if he's here. He told me that, and he called Dave Barrett his mentor. He said, there's a perception out there that he didn't consider himself Jewish. It's actually the contrary. I remember distinctly how proud he was of being the first Jewish premier. Dave Barrett had been a director of the Jewish Community Center. He had worked previously at Jewish Family Services. A group, including Bernie Simpson at the JCC, tried to get Barrett to continue his role at the JCC, but he was very ambitious and had determined early in the 1960s that he wanted to be premier. So he continued in politics. Joe Barrett, Barrett's son, I spoke to him. He said it was a fundamental, deep part of who he was. And whether this is exactly true or not, Joe Barrett remembered that his father's first act as premier was to remove the covenants on property titles, where say when selling a property, you could say no Jews, no Sikhs, no blacks in places like the British properties. Shirley Barrett, Dave's widow, recalled Passover Seders at her mother-in-law's home and said her husband was basically a humanist, but he was a secular Jew. He was always proud to be a Jew. He grew up with the values of his parents and he never relented on his heritage. He was an insatiable reader. And one of the topics he returned to repeatedly was trying to understand the history of his people. Gloria Levy, who was the wife of Norm Levy, who was one of the cabinet ministers in the Barrett government, the two families were extremely close, and Gloria Levy told me, Barrett was very respectful and very admiring of Norm and me because we wore our Judaism on our sleeve and he didn't, but it meant a lot to him. I think his whole social ethic came from feeling Jewish. I think his sense of justice was definitely influenced from being Jewish. He was always the one who was seen as different because he was Jewish. He was an East Side kid and had to fight his way a lot of the times. The Levy and Barrett daughters, as well as the daughter of another non-Jewish NDP stalwart, Stu Leggett, all attended Camp Miriam together and remained friends. Now Dave Barrett, once, it was kind of weird, Dave Barrett said to me that he felt that the Jewish community never forgave him for recalling the legislature on Yom Kippur. I have never heard that from anyone in the Jewish community. I only ever heard that from Dave Barrett. So I don't know if, I don't know where he got that. I mean, I'm sure that there were people who weren't pleased with it, but he seemed to have thought that left some kind of scar on his relationship with the community, but I don't know. In any event, okay, so that gives you a rundown on the quite unbelievable stuff that that Barrett did. In my thesis of revolution or rerun, you would wonder if a lot of the NDP policies were indeed revolutionary, but at the same time, if that were so, wouldn't the actions of the re-elected Social Credit Party under Bill Bennett, the son of WAC, wouldn't they have brought about a counter-revolution? And there certainly was a major shift away from some of the NDP policies when Bill Bennett became premier. But if you think back to that list, most of the things that the Barrett government did remain with us in one way or another. So it may not have been a rerun, but was it a revolution if so many of the legacies remain? Maybe, maybe not, but here is a definite rerun. With the election of the NDP in 1972, and we're going to back and forth a little bit here because we've got sort of parallel narratives. Obviously, the worst nightmare of the free enterprisers was realized, and the center-right parties knew full well that it was their divisions that had allowed the NDP to win a majority government with 39% of the vote. Now, Bill Bennett, with no political experience, succeeded his father as social credit leader, and after the 1972 defeat, there was an ad hoc unity movement aiming to merge the Social Credit, the Conservative Party, and the Liberal Party. Interestingly, this was essentially what his father had tried to do in the late 1940s. But conversely, Bill Bennett was absolutely dead set against this, totally refused the idea of negotiating a melding, a unification of the three parties. He said, the Liberals and the Conservatives should come over and join me in social credit. That could have been a disaster because for those parties, because if it hadn't worked, the NDP could have been reelected again with 39% of the vote. But it instead worked brilliantly. And what happened was, of the 5 Liberal MLAs, 3 crossed the floor to join Social Credit. That was Gardy Gardam and Pat McGeer from the dual member riding of Point Grey, and Alan Williams from West Vancouver. And of the 2 Conservative MLAs, Hugh Curtis from the Conservatives in Saanich Gulf Islands came over, and all 3 of those people would become at the absolute heart of the Bennett government for the next decade or more. And so what happened in that period was not a formal coalition, but a sort of an informal coalition where the Liberal and Conservative parties were basically gutted through what's the word? Well, the people leaving and joining Social Credit. And so now, one thing we cannot discuss about the revival of Social Credit, we cannot understand without understanding this person. Grace McCarthy, after the defeat in 1972, she traveled the province and she built Social Credit into a modern political machine, almost single-handedly. And if you read about this, it's an absolutely extraordinary story of how Social Credit never really had the structure, like the infrastructure of a successful political party all through the WAC Bennett years. And she put that in place while Bill Bennett was pulling Conservative and Liberal MLAs into his fold. She was building on the ground. And when the party returned in the 1975 election, she was one of the foremost cabinet ministers holding positions as Minister of Economic Development, Provincial Secretary, Human Resources, Social Services, and Tourism. She never became Premier, but I think it's safe to say that there is no person outside the Bennetts who was more integral to the history of Social Credit in British Columbia. And many of you probably know her. She was deeply, deeply engaged in the Jewish community, not only for partisan purposes. She really had a connection. And in fact, just a couple of years ago, shortly before she died, she came to a gala that I was helping to organize for the Vancouver Holocaust Education Center. Excuse me. Bill Bennett, for an untested new premier, solidified his grip on the party almost instantly. If his father had run a government that was sometimes tough to peg on the political spectrum, Bennett the Younger was a more typical right-wing politician of the 1970s and 80s. He introduced a restraint program to rein in spending, slashing services to vulnerable communities. He massively cut education budgets, cut thousands of civil service jobs, weakened labor regulations, and basically poked organized labor with sticks. While slashing spending, he also oversaw some massive hikes in taxes and fees. He increased the sales tax, car insurance premiums went up 140%, and BC ferry fares went up 100%. The Bennett government's austerity measures, curtailing of collective bargaining rights, and chipping away at the Barrett government's human rights apparatus, among other things, led to a massive social upheaval under the umbrella of Operation Solidarity. There was a one-day general strike and tens of thousands of protesters at a giant rally in Vancouver, but Bennett dismissed those as sour grapes by people who had lost the last election. While Bennett slashed spending on social programs and in other areas, he also had his father's fondness for massive projects. He brought Expo 86 to Vancouver, oversaw the creation of SkyTrain, the Vancouver Trade and Convention Center, and the Coquihalla Highway. Now, the 1979 election was particularly interesting from a number of perspectives. For one thing, federally, Pierre Trudeau had almost got to the end of his 5-year term and he had to call an election. He called an election for May 22nd, 79. A couple of days later, Bill Bennett goes on television and announces a provincial election for May 10th. Now, of course, there is a federal social credit party, but it was unrelated to the provincial social credit party. So social credit did not have a federal wing. The NDP now were faced with fighting a provincial election and a federal election at the same time. The Conservatives, they basically, there's a whole story there. I won't go into it. Joe Clark had a very nasty conversation with the BC Conservative leader on a tour here. The Liberals decided to focus on the federal election, and they ran only 5 candidates in the election, and predictably got less than 1% of the popular vote. In that election, neither the last surviving Liberal in the legislature, Gordon Gibson, and the last surviving Conservative in the legislature, Scott Wallace, did not run again. And it was the first time since 1903 that there was neither a Liberal nor a Conservative in the legislature. The Liberal experience, I'm coming back to this, this is a recurring thread here. In that election in 1979, where they almost ceased to exist, that was the lowest ebb for the Liberal Party, and they began a slow crawl back to relevance. In 1982, an individual by the name of Shirley McLaughlin she was leader of the Liberal Party. I was her personal assistant during the campaign. She managed to pull together 52 candidates for the 57 seats, rather impressive compared to the 5 in the previous election. But, you know, if you remember back 1982, the Liberal name in British Columbia was not particularly good. The national energy policy of the federal government had implications here. And she won 2.7% of the vote, but it was a little better than where they had been standing before. In the 1986 election, Art Lee, former member of parliament, he was leader. He did a little better, brought it up to about 7%, still didn't win a seat. Here he is pictured with Iona Campanola, who was a member of parliament in the same class as him, later went on to become British Columbia's lieutenant governor. Now, back to that pivotal year, 1986. In the middle of Expo 86, Bill Bennett announced his retirement. What would social credit look like without a Bennett at the helm for the first time? Well, Bill Bennett trounced more seasoned politicians when he ran for social credit leader in 1973, thanks Dad. The race to succeed him was a free-for-all. And anybody who was around at the time, the names are a VIP list of figures from that time: Bill Vander Zalm, Grace McCarthy, Brian Smith, Jim Nielsen, John Reynolds, Stephen Rogers, and so on. Little footnote to history: the first person to be eliminated on the first ballot was a former Vancouver school trustee who had the chutzpah to think she should be premier, a woman by the name of Kim Campbell, who won 14 votes and was disqualified, but I believe later went on to become Prime Minister of Canada for about 5 minutes. In any event, that race was won by Bill Vander Zalm. Now, Bill Vander Zalm, believe it or not, I think a lot of people don't realize this, he is a former Liberal. He had run for the leadership of the BC Liberal Party and lost. Then he became mayor of Surrey, where he cracked down on what he called welfare deadbeats. Then when he was sworn in as Minister of Human Resources in Bill Bennett's government, he declared, if someone is able to work and refuses to do so, they had best pick up a shovel or I'll give them a shovel. The Social Credit Party was always economically conservative. I think most people would agree by most measures. While the party's constitution and roots were steeped in Christian rhetoric, neither Bennett was particularly religious and were not apparently interested in hot-button social issues. Vander Zalm most decidedly was. He attempted to ban public funds for the delivery of abortions, which sparked a conflict that consumed the province for years. In addition to the policy controversies he stirred up, he also drew controversy with his business dealings. His sale of his fantasy garden theme park type attraction in Richmond to Chinese investors was found in a conflict of interest report to have mixed private business with public office, and he was charged with breach of trust. He resigned before the end of his term, but the following year was found not guilty. He was replaced by Rita Johnston, British Columbia's first female and last social credit premier. And what happened in the 1991 election is a tectonic revolution in BC politics. Mike Harcourt was the popular former mayor of Vancouver. He was the NDP leader by this point. After 5 tumultuous years of Bill Vander Zalm, the Social Credit Party was very unpopular, but given the reality of BC politics that whatever the Free Enterprise Party is always has a floor below which it probably will not fall, there was certainly reason to believe that they still had a fighting chance until 10 days before the election, the televised leaders debate. The Liberal Party was led by an almost unknown municipal official from the Sunshine Coast, Gordon Wilson, who had become leader of the Liberal Party in 1987. If there's truly such a thing as a single line in a debate changing the course of history, it was one sentence from Wilson in the middle of a rancorous battle between Johnston and Harcourt. I apologize. I tried to get the video and upload it here. It's just my technical skills wouldn't permit it. But these two were just going at it, hammer and tong, and Wilson managed to elbow his way in to declare, "This reminds me of the legislature, and here's a classic example why nothing ever gets done in the province of British Columbia." What I guess happened then was a huge number of British Columbians who didn't want the NDP, but were very disgruntled with social credit, saw that there might be another place for them to park their votes. Within days, the BCTV nightly polls routinely showed the Liberals in the lead. Some of the Liberals thought they might win, and rumors I've heard is that this terrified some of them. The original party policy book that they had put out contained hundreds of promises, and just days before the election, they went through with a red pen and slashed out promise after promise to say, okay, here's what we really will do if we, and they were just outright acknowledged, we never thought this would happen. You have to understand that the Liberal Party at that time, they probably thought that the best they could do was win 4 seats. I know there were 4 seats that they particularly had their eyes on, that realistically they probably thought they might win 1. I'll bet a lot of them were expecting yet another shutout. Incredibly, the final result, the NDP won like they were expected, but the Liberals won 17 seats. Now, live by the sword, die by the sword. For 50 years, Social Credit had been telling British Columbians that there could only be one free enterprise party, and they were it. Looking at these numbers, it's a hard argument to make with a straight face, but they did try to make it. They said, we're the only free enterprise party with any experience. Be that as it may, just to give an indication of the impact that that one sentence by Wilson had, here's the riding I live in. The incumbent John Savage, who was the Minister of Agriculture, had won about 50% of the vote in the previous election. He won 6,700 votes, spent $48,000. That rounds out to $7 a vote. The NDP spent 33,000, got 6,500 votes. That rounds up to $5 a vote. The Liberal, who never thought he would win, spent $4,000, and I'll bet he didn't spend that till the last week because money started pouring in to campaigns that were, they didn't even print brochures or lawn signs. He wins 40% of the vote with $4,000, 47 cents a vote, just to give you a comparison. Even more extreme, Richmond Steveston, incumbent Rick Lunan spends almost $10 per vote, $44,000, gets 26%. Alan Warnke spends $2,300, wins with 38% of the vote, 35 cents a vote compared to $9.60 a vote. You know, money isn't everything, obviously, but the point was the Liberal campaigns on the ground had no volunteers, no money, no nothing, and they were buoyed simply by that one line from Wilson at the debate. What is truly, I think, astonishing is the absolute mirror image of the Liberal gains and the social credit losses. Province-wide, compared to the 1986 election, the Liberals went up 26.5 points. Social credit went down 25.3. Even more exact were some regions. Lower Mainland, Liberals up 27.1, social credit down 27.3. Vancouver Island, Liberals up 27.5, social credit down 27.9. I can't imagine a time in political history where you would see that direct a shift in voters. Now we're going to fast forward through here in order to get back to our theme here. And Mike Harcourt had a bit of a rough 5 years in office. There were a lot of flubs, the fast ferries and so forth. It was a time of incredible strife between the environmentalists and the forest industry and their unionized workers, which quite remarkably, the NDP managed not to be completely split apart by. In any event, as I won't go into details, we discussed it a little in the chat session before, he resigned before the end of his term. He was replaced with Glenn Clark. Glenn Clark had his kick at the can. He resigned before the end of his thing. Ujjal Dosanjh replaced him. And by the time he got to the election, we ended up with the greatest landslide in BC history, with the new Liberal leader, Gordon Campbell, winning 77 out of 79 seats, the NDP reduced to 2. So, but let's step back to see how Campbell and the Liberals ended up at this extraordinary point. First of all, if Mike Harcourt was having an unexpectedly challenging time as Premier, Gordon Wilson was having a far worse go of it as opposition leader. His caucus of 17 was a mishmash of people who never expected to get elected. At best, the party had, as I said, probably hoped to win 1 or 2 seats. They end up with 17. It's a real mixed bag. There were constant internal party squabbles, and ultimately, the fact that Wilson was having an affair with his now wife, Judy Tiabji, at a time when they were both married to other people, and the cover-up, I guess, around that is what history says was the reason for his ouster as Liberal leader. I think there was a little more to it. I think some of his caucus probably watched him and thought that maybe he's not premier material. I don't think he was probably necessarily a team player, but then I also wonder how many successful politicians really are. I don't think I'm being a conspiracist when I say that what was really taking place was the co-optation or the co-optation of the revolution into yet another rerun. The people who had always funded social credit, primarily downtown Vancouver business elites, didn't know this Wilson guy, and they certainly didn't control him. Whatever the cause, Wilson was forced into a race to defend his leadership, and it turned into a 3-Gordon race. Gordon Gibson, the last Liberal leader to be in the legislature in the 1970s, he threw his hat in the ring. Gordon Mill fought to keep his job. Gordon Campbell, former mayor of Vancouver, always considered a possible candidate for premier, jumped in. So we had the Gordon of Liberal past, the Gordon of Liberal present, and the Gordon of Liberal future. We all know the outcome. Now, Wilson brought the party back from the dead, but unlike Moses, never saw the promised land. Now, any thought that, the whole theme here is that the Liberal Party hung on through the lean times and somehow managed to eventually claw its way back into office. But any hope of social credit repeating that sort of thing failed or were dashed on February 17th, 1994. Finally, after being defeated by Rita Johnston for the Social Credit Party leadership, once the party was practically dead and half buried, finally Grace McCarthy became party leader. At the same time, roughly the same time, Gordon Campbell became Liberal Party leader. They both needed seats. Art Cowie resigned his seat in Vancouver Quilchena to open it up for Gordon Campbell. You might have thought that's kind of McCarthy's old stomping ground, but she thought better of it, and she went to one of the only 7 remaining social credit seats in the province, the one closest to Vancouver, in Matsqui. And I always just can't quite picture the Shaughnessy matron who had been at the height of British Columbia politics, schlepping her way out to Matsqui and shaking hands through the farms and exurban sprawl out that way. But astonishingly, after all that she had done in politics, she lost that by-election to a young guy named Mike de Jong. But the party still died a slow and painful death. Incredibly, this last election, last year in 2020, was the first election since 1933 with no social credit candidates. But the bigger question is, did a quarter of the province's population suddenly move ideologically? Did 1 in 4 voters who had supported what was by some measures the most right-wing government in Canada under Bill Vander Zalm suddenly become raving centrists? UBC professors Donald Blake and Kenneth Carty had been surveying delegates to liberal social credit and NDP conventions in BC. Their work helps answer the question, how did a party that was moribund for half a century and left for dead by most voters revive itself to become the dominant political force it is? The answer is, it didn't really. In 1987, when the professors asked delegates at the Liberal convention that elected Gordon Wilson as leader, when asked to place their party on a 7-point scale rating from left to right, 87% placed their party at the center or within 1 point on either side of the center. A large majority placed the NDP on the left and social credit on the right, basically with the Liberal Party in the middle. By 1993, many of the new members were disaffected Socreds whose addition to the Liberal activist group has shifted the Liberal Party's ideological position toward the right, they wrote. Half of the interviewees had joined the Liberal Party just in 1993. Of these, more than 1/4 had been previously involved in another party, 75% of them with social credit. On the social spending dimension, by 1993, Liberals were virtually indistinguishable from delegates who attended the 1991 Social Credit Leadership Convention. This represents a remarkable shift from 1987, the professors wrote, when views on social spending among Liberal activists strongly resembled those of the New Democrats. So what happened was maybe not so much a revolution. It may have been a nascent revolution, but it was co-opted by the people who were, for all intents, either the actual people who had been the backbone of social credit or their ideological descendants. So to bring the finale around to my thesis, what's the difference? The Liberals replaced social credit first by defeating them, but then held them at bay by essentially becoming them. Social credit, a half century earlier, had replaced the coalition first by defending them and then basically by becoming them. An adage some of our parents might use is that there's nothing new under the sun. So as revolutionary as many things might seem at the time, often in hindsight, they can appear surprisingly repetitious. So I hope my presentation didn't seem too repetitious, but anyway, so here just an example. I wanted, it's amazing what's on the internet and what's not, because I literally could not find on the internet a social credit logo from that era, but the colors and the schemes are very similar, the BC Liberals now and the social credit then. In any event, thank you very much for listening to me, and I would be delighted at any questions I will try to answer. There are probably people on here who could answer many of them better than me, but I welcome any comments or questions.
Before the, David, yeah, before the questions roll in, I'd like to know if I could just have 2 minutes. Pat, thanks for this. For me, it was a stroll down memory lane from 1980 through 1990. I arrived in BC in 1981 to work for Social Credit and Bill Bennett. And our goal was to modernize the party. Yes, Grace McCarthy had set the groundwork over the previous decade, but we were there to modernize it. Brought some of the ideas from the Ontario Progressive Conservative Party, Big Blue Machine. I wanted to mention 2 brief stories, one serious, one humorous, that touch on perhaps our experience in the Jewish community and with Temple Sholom. First one was the very first constituency I visited when I came into BC was Chilliwack. At the time, Chilliwack was known as having the most churches per capita, not only in BC, but in Canada. It sort of sets the background here. I went to that meeting. Grace McCarthy, ironically, was the guest speaker. I walked into the room. At the back of the room, the meeting room, was a table, and it was full of social credit literature. And to my amazement and dismay, a number of books were anti-Semitic books that had been written by various people who were most involved with the Social Credit Party in Alberta. After the meeting, I talked to Grace McCarthy about this, and she said not to worry about it. It was very much a rump group. But I left that meeting driving back into Vancouver thinking to myself, why did I ever take this job if this is what social credit is about? But I quickly discovered, of course, that it wasn't about that at all, as you pointed out, Pat. The other story is humorous. Social credit had a women's auxiliary. It was made up of what were known in the day as the little old ladies with gray hair. And in the late 1970s, they had one of their conventions. And at the time, across the country, various governments were passing legislation that sex offenders would be castrated. Well, the Women's Auxiliary passed a resolution at their conference, and they got things a little mixed up because they said that for sex offenders, they should be circumcised. So I thought everyone here would enjoy that. The newspapers, of course, had a ball with it, but I thought being part of the Temple community, you might enjoy that story. Anyway, I'll break off there. Thanks very much. One final thing, Pat. Yeah. You pointed out that Bill Bennett never wanted to acknowledge that social credit was a coalition, and I remember bringing that up to him sometime during the 1983 election. And he just came down on me. He said, we are not a coalition. He never accepted that concept. He said, we are a standalone party that people join because they believe in what we're doing. And so it verifies what you had to say. Anyway, I'll break off there. Someday I'll write a book all about it.
Thank you. That's interesting, in fact, because it hit me like a brick when Christy Clark was traveling the province with Bill Bennett's son. Was it what? I can't remember Bill Bennett's son's name. But anyway, sorry, you're muted, Jerry. Can you unmute, Jerry?
Yeah, I think it was. Is it Brent Bennett? Brent?
I think that's a grandson. But
oh, okay.
Anyway. Anyway, she would use the word coalition, and I thought that's something the Bennetts never used. Gordon Campbell never used that. And interestingly, and this was something that I didn't have time to add, and you'll be fully aware of this, is that Gordon Campbell did what Bill Bennett did 20 years earlier, and that was, no, I'm not forming a coalition with that Reform Party of BC or any other party. They can come and join me. And you might say that that cost him the 1996 election. But when he won in 2001, it was his party, and that he owed no IOUs to anybody. The other thing you mentioned, and it's interesting, the anti-Semitic components of social credit, and of course at the federal level, for whatever little rump group still calls themselves social credit, they are a very problematic group. But there were absolutely, including the Minister of Finance in Alberta under Aberhart, were just steeped in anti-Semitism. And it was Ernest Manning, Preston's father, who purged the party of the anti-Semites to the best of his ability, and he deserves to be remembered for that.
Okay, Pat, it's Sharon. I can remember in I guess it was the 50s, when it was the heyday of the social credit, the terrible, I won't say terrible, all the, let's put it, the anti-Semitism, especially of Gallardi, and all his programs on the radio extorting anti-Semitism. And there was a great deal of concern within the Jewish community. What can you say about that period? Do you know very much about it?
Well, that's interesting. I don't. I mean, I guess I'd say I'm not really surprised. I mean, Gallardi was an evangelical Christian minister. There is a good, well, there's a biography of him called Friend of Mine by a guy whose name escapes me, who went on to become mayor of Kamloops. It's a rather, I'm afraid that the author fell in love with Gallardi in the process of writing the book, and it is not terribly critical. It's a fun read, but not terribly critical. And I honestly do not recall, it had been a couple of years since I read that, but I don't recall if that was addressed. And honestly, yeah, I mean, as I said, in some ways I'm not surprised, just because of his evangelical angle. But at the same time, I would have thought I would have heard more about it, that it would have been a bigger issue, because I didn't, at the federal level and in Alberta, and God forbid in Quebec, the Social Credit Party in the 1970s had a literal neo-Nazi in the National Assembly. But I didn't think that the BC Social Credit Party, I mean, their constitution in their early years were steeped in all this Christian rhetoric, but under both Bennett's, those guys were not, I mean, WAC was a teetotaler, but I don't know if the guy ever went to church, either of them, frankly. I just don't know. Maybe Jerry knows, but.
Pat, I knew Gallardi, and in his later years, for sure, I never detected any anti-Semitism in him.
Yeah.
I think what he did admire were people who had some religious, not only religious background, but some making religious effort, living religious lives. I think he admired that no matter which faith it was.
Yeah.
Sure, he would have loved to convert, but I didn't detect in him negative thoughts.
Good. By the way, I don't want to, something I just said may have made it sound like I think every single Christian is an anti-Semite. I didn't mean that. I just.
I knew quite a few of the cabinet ministers in WAC's cabinet. At that time, I was doing lobbying for the trustees, the school trustees.
Oh.
And some of those people were magnificent ministers. Bennett gave them their heads. Les Peterson was one, as well as Gallardi.
Yeah. I highly, highly recommend anybody who hasn't read. This really is David Mitchell, who actually was one of the 17 first Liberals elected in 1991, wrote, I guess probably the definitive biography of WAC, called WAC Bennett and the Rise of British Columbia. It is monumental. And just a little silly story. I had read it I guess when it came out. I was reading it again during the 1991 campaign. I was reading it in bed, and I'm pretty sure that Gordon Wilson was reading it too, and we were at the exact same place, because all through the campaign, I would read a chapter or two at night, and the next morning I would wake up and Gordon Wilson was making reference to something W.A.C. Bennett did in the chapter I had read the night before. So I think we were at the same pace in the book. Anyway, and it's interesting. I mean, I don't think there is a British Columbia politician who hasn't studied W.A.C. Bennett to see how that unbelievably successful politician operated.
I can add a little bit to the Gallardi story.
Yeah.
In that I lived in Silverdale at the time, and which is near Mission, part of the Mission municipality.
Oh, okay.
Went to high school in Mission, and there were two cousins of Phil Gallardi's, and I can assure you that there was no anti-Semitism amongst them. So I knew that two families, not terribly well, but well enough to know that. But I'd like to tell another story about the creation of Icbc, which I think was 1973. At the time, the minister made it known that because they're a socialist government, everybody would pay the same premium, unless he had
High premium.
unless he or she had an accident or a conviction or something like that that warranted a higher premiums. And I remember writing to the minister at that time and said, look, we know from statistics that those between the ages of 16 and 25 are hell on wheels, especially young men, not so much young women, but almost as bad. And therefore, the insurance industry has always charged them a little bit more. And we should keep that the same theory. He wrote back and said, no, if they haven't had a conviction or an accident, they should not pay more. So I wrote back again and said, look, if that's the case, I think you should enact something in that insurance premiums for life insurance should be the same for 16-year-olds and 80-year-olds, because the 80-year-old hasn't died either. To which I never got an answer.
Okay.
That was my story of the creation of Icbc. But
I was the constituency assistant for David Mitchell for 3 years, from
I'm sorry, who's
1991 to
speaking? I can't see you.
almost 94, I guess. And, you know, it's interesting about the rise of the Liberal Party in 1991. Most of the MLAs that got elected were completely unprepared, as you said. And I'll just share a couple of anecdotes. Right after the election, some of these MLAs were so unprepared. Some of them were not even employed. Alan Warnke, for example, slept in his car in the first session of Parliament because he wanted to keep the stipend, that the money that you got for your parliamentary stipend for the sitting of the legislature. Doug Simons from Richmond only owned one suit and did not own a stick of deodorant. I remember that really distinctly, unfortunately.
Maybe that's why he was the one-termer?
Maybe. When the budget came down, Fred Gingell was the finance critic, and he hosted basically the world's largest Scotch party to in the lockup to review the budget, and proceeded to get absolutely plastered while they went through the budget. It's interesting to be a fly on the wall for all of this, but the most interesting one is that Gordon Wilson's paranoia about David Mitchell. He was, and I would say it's probably wasn't unfounded, because I think David had designs to become premier, or
Sure.
at least to become the leader of the Liberal Party. But one instance, when you talked about that line that Gordon Wilson delivered in the debate, when he said, "This is why nothing ever gets done in BC." Well, he was fed that line by Jim Bennett, who was the campaign manager for David Mitchell, and Jim Bennett was the previous principal secretary for many years of Grace McCarthy. And this is how the whole thing weaved together.
Oh yeah.
And it was fascinating to be a fly on the wall. And I would love to share more stories, but it won't take up more time. But this has brought up so many memories for me. So thank you so much for hosting this and for agreeing to do it. Thank you.
Well, and by the way, talking about things coming together, I think Adam, didn't we go to high school together to Wasson?
Yes, and we both worked at the Jewish Western Bulletin, because my gig before David Mitchell was a year at the Bulletin under Sam and Mona Kaplan. So if you ever wanted to work, if you ever wanted to understand absolute monarchy or tyranny, then you should look into that.
I had a taste.
Pat, we have some questions that have come in on the chat. First one is, how has immigration into BC and increasing diversity changed the political equation in BC?
Oh boy.
I don't know. I mean, there might be other people who have a better perspective. One of the things, I've been talking to some of the folks in Richmond lately, and it was explained to me, frankly, I said, I can't believe that there are still any non-Cantonese or Mandarin speakers on Richmond City Council. And I was informed that if we think that, the Liberal Party or the NDP have divisions within them, just try some of the ethnic communities. And I suppose you can just think of some of the divisions in the Jewish community and extrapolate if the community were bigger. I don't know, does anybody else have, I think it always takes time for the demographic changes to really impact the political sphere. And it's also shocking to realize how recently, for instance, I believe Mo Sahota, who is within the living memory of most of us, I believe was the first Indo-Canadian cabinet minister in BC, if not in Canada. And only in, when was sorry, I didn't have the numbers. I did read this recently, but Indo-Canadians, Chinese, First Nations did not even have the vote in some of the times that we're talking about here. But I don't know, does somebody else have more perspective on the impacts that changing demographics are having on BC politics? I think the political parties do a fairly good job of, I guess, integrating and reflecting and representing the changes in the community. I guess that's a short answer, but I apologize that I'm not more sort of on top of that one.
Very interesting.
Okay, Pat, the next question, the impact of the Green Party in BC.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think everybody always assumes that the Green Party takes votes from the NDP. And I've never seen studies, but I've heard anecdotes that people say, nope, that's not true. They take it from across the spectrum. So in terms of the impact that the Green Party voters have on affecting election outcomes, I'm not sure that it is, that you're going to see something like the mirror image that you saw in the way the Liberals gained and the Socreds lost almost 1-to-1. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think we have seen it happen. It's interesting that when the Green Party did the best it has ever done, winning 3 seats in the election before last, it was when the NDP won their minority government. So it is not a zero-sum game. So whether the Green Party can ever reach a point where they threaten to form government, I don't see that time coming anytime too soon. But that might also depend on the personalities, because you would have said the same thing until Gordon Wilson uttered that line at the debate. So who knows? Anything could happen.
I think we should take one more question if somebody wants to jump in. Here's a comment that's come in. It's interesting to compare the dissolving of the liberal conservative coalition of the 40s and the implosion of the NPA in Vancouver. Any thoughts on whether a new party or WAC Bennett character will emerge to take Vancouver City Hall?
And a WAC Bennett character, I don't see that happening, but absolutely there's going to be a new party there because you know, I'm not, I mean, I used to, you know, cover City Hall for the Vancouver Courier, but I'm not really plugged in like that now. But, you know, what is going on in the NPA right now is bizarre. It seemed, well, no, I won't speculate. I won't speculate, but it sounds like it's been taken over by kooks. I'll just put it that way. And unless, you know, unless somebody comes in and is able to grab that party back, you know, there'll be a new one. I mean, you know, we're past that stage. The creation and success of Vision and then its collapse is an example of how, you know, the old COPE NPA binary has been broken. And I don't think that given the at-large system and so forth, that it is that unthinkable that somebody could just come in and say, I'm starting a new party. I've got 2 or 3 sitting councillors who are currently independent who have jumped on board. I mean, it has to happen. I mean, they've got a year and a half, and the NPA voters have to go somewhere. You know, that party is just imploding. So I don't know what is going to happen, but something will come up on that front, sure. WAC Bennett, I don't think so. I think they broke the mold on that one.
Here's our last question: the impact of unions on the NDP over the years.
Well, I've made brief reference to the fact that it's maybe an underappreciated miracle of the Harcourt years that the party had its problems in those years, but it did not implode from the divisions between their resource-based union folks and their environmental wing. That is almost a miracle in itself. I don't think the CCF NDP would ever have gotten to any of the levels of success that they got without the support of unions. It's absolutely critical. Not only, I mean, you know, if you've ever worked in an NDP campaign, it's a very hierarchical thing. A lot of the NDP campaigns are run by people who are seconded from provincial unions and are essentially professional politicians who bide their time between elections in the union jobs. But you know, the changes in legislation that prevent donations of money from businesses and unions is going to have an effect on the outcomes. I'm not sure how much effect it's going to have on the machine structure of the NDP, but I don't think you can overstate at all the strength of the unions in the NDP and the impact that they've had. I don't think the NDP would be a shadow of what it is without the support of union leaders and rank and file.
For sure.
We have this comment that did come in. This has been fascinating, exclamation mark. Many thanks, Pat. And now with that, I'm going to turn it back to Larry.
Thank you all for inviting me very much.
Thanks,
and for listening to me.
Yeah, thanks, David. And Pat, as to echo what Jeffrey Drucker has written in the chat box, as a transplant myself from Ontario, I came out here in the late 70s. I've found BC politics absolutely fascinating. And this has been so informative. I can actually make sense of it now.
No, you can't.
Yeah. Well, yes, I can at least follow some dots now. There's a journey here. Anyway, Pat, absolutely fascinating. Time tonight is just flown by for me, and I'm sure for everyone here. Thank you so much for doing this. We appreciate it so much. And thank you all for coming tonight. Stay
Pat.
safe and stay well. Thanks, Pat.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Pat. Really enjoyed that.
Good night, everyone.
Night.
Good night. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.